If I remember, holding on Ois Gimel of the Mimer. That's on page 6. And we were speaking about the Mila, what's so special about Tu B'Av over Tesvav B'Nissen and Tesvav B'Tishrei, which is the Yom Tov of Pesach and the Yom Tov of Sukkot. And we were speaking about essentially there's the level of Tesvav B'Nissen is the Yidden when they are on the level of Tzaddikim, and Tishrei is the level of Baal Tshuva. And even with all those milos, still enough, when we come to the 15th of Tesvav B'Av, that's even higher than the 15th of Nisan, the 15th of Tishrei, both the higher milo than Tzaddikim and the higher milo of Baal Tshuva. So to be able to explain this, and we also explained that the Nisan has to do with the mitzvah. We brought in the pasuk Kinei mitzvah v'Torah Oir, that the Rebbe Rashab explains in Kunstzeitz Chaim that after there's Ner mitzvah and Torah Oir, there's Derech Chaim, the way of life. The way of life is something more. So the question is, what's that Derech Chaim that's something more? So we were explaining. We started first explaining that Ner mitzvah has to do and corresponds to the level of Tesvav B'Nissen, because by the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, they had mitzvahs, and up until Matan Torah, they had different mitzvahs that Abishur gave them, starting with Avraham Avinu's mitzvah Smila, and then the mitzvahs having to do with the Korban Pesach, etc., etc. But Torah, that's the idea having to do with the Luchas Achroinis that were given on Yom Kippur. Yom Chasunos is a Matan Torah, and the completion of Yom Kippur comes out in Tesvav B'Tishrei on Sukkot. So therefore, the idea of Torah is again corresponds to Nisan and Tishrei, and still in all we say Kinei mitzvah v'Torah, even though there's a level of the candle of the mitzvah and there's a level of Torah, there's still Derech Chaim, the level that's higher than both of them. The question is, what is this Derech Chaim that's greater than both? Just like we're asking about what's the Tesvav B'Av that's greater than Tesvav B'Nisan and Tesvav B'Tishrei. So he's going to continue what the Rebbe Rashab explained over there in Kunstzeitz Chaim about Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Oir V'Derech Chaim. Ois Gimel on the bottom of page 6. He explains in Kunstzeitz Chaim, the fact that the pasuk likened the mitzvah to a candle and the Torah to a light or the fire. So the Shalah explains, what's it referring to when it says a candle? It's talking about a single candle. The level of oil that Torah is likened to oil, that's like a big conflagration, a big flame, a large, something a very big fire. That of Zamraz al and in a similar way, not exact, we're going to soon see a difference. Chazal say in Masechta Soitam, the Torah connected the mitzvah with Neir mitzvah with Torah, but the Torah, they connected the Torah to light. So then the Chazal and Soita go on to explain this a little bit more. And again, you're going to see how it's different than the Shalah. As a mitzvah b'neir loy melacha, why is it compared to mitzvah to candle to teach you? Just like a candle only is something that protects for a while. In other words, the candle burns and then it goes out. So to a mitzvah only protects temporarily. And over there the Gemara discusses protects the person when he's doing the mitzvah, not when he's not doing the mitzvah, etc. But the Torah ba'or, and the Torah and the pasuk links the Torah to light. What does it mean by the word or? Loy melachah to tell you, mam or megan lo'olam, just like the light is something that protects forever. Torah megina lo'olam, so too the Torah is not just temporary like a candle, but it protects forever. So based on this, if you really analyze it, you see that the Shalah's idea about a candle versus a big flame is not necessarily the approach of the Gemara over there. Fire, the Rebbe Rashab explained over there in Kunseitz Chaim, Shalfiza, Mashma, according to this, it seems to be indicated the Oir Hainu Oir Hayoim. Now, when it talks about the Torah being likened to light, because light is forever, that's talking about daylight, because the sun always exists, the sun doesn't come weak, the sun is always there. Not like the Shallah writes that the Oir, the Torah Oir, the Oir that's likened to is a big conflagration. The Oir Hayoim Odiv Gam Dura Gedoyla, because daylight is even greater and better and more powerful and more lasting. In all ways, it's better than even a great fire. So that is the two ways of looking at Torah Oir. But whichever way you want to look at Torah Oir, there is something beyond the Ner Mitzvah and beyond the Torah Oir. What is that? Something that's even higher than daylight. That's what it says in the pasuk concerning Mashiach's times. The sun will not be any more for you for the light of the day. Hashem will be for you the light of the world. In other words, there's a higher level of light, higher obviously than a candle, higher than a daylight. It'll be that Hashem himself will be your illumination. Now the Rebbe brings in how does one connect with this light of Hashem? That's through the studying the inner part of the Torah. Like we mentioned yesterday, that the Kuntres Chaim was about bringing home the message and the importance of learning the inner part of the Torah, especially the Bachrim that were just new to Temim and so on. So, in the idea of study of Primis HaTorah, with that we fulfill what it says in the pasuk, Da'as Elokei Avicha, know the God of your father. What results from studying the inner part of the Torah? What results from knowing the God of your father? Then it comes about of Deu B'Lev Sholem. Then it comes about you shall serve him with a complete heart. What's it mean you shall serve him with a complete heart? By days a Yavel the Aviyira, through the study of the inner part of the Torah, a person comes to love and awe of Hashem until a higher most level of awe. Like it's explained over there in Kunsteitz Chaim, the details of this topic. And the Rebbe Rashab concludes, that's the idea of the way of life that we were asking, that what is the way of life that is beyond Neir Mitzvah Torah Oir. So what's in addition to that? What are we adding to that? We're adding the Koyal Primis HaTorah. It's referring to the inner part of the Torah. Why is the inner part of the Torah called the way of life? Because we mentioned this also yesterday outside. Because the level of Primis HaTorah is called the tree of life, as opposed to Eitz Hadas Toiv. The Nigla Torah is called the tree of knowledge of good and bad, because Nigla Torah deals with kosher and asur and mutter and chayev and zakai. It descends, and from it is the shtalshum in yonim that have to do with klippus. So therefore, it's a level of Eitz Hadas. But the Primis HaTorah is only a level of totally removed from the world and from yonim that eventually will evolve into klippus. That's why it's called Eitz HaChaim. So the Derech Chaim, the way of life, which is Techachas Musar, it teaches us ethical teachings, etc., teaches us how to have a love and awe of Hashem. The Derech Chaim, that's the study of Primis HaTorah. Based on that, now the Rebbe is going to bring it back to our question about the advantage and the height and the quality of Tu B'Av over Tesvav B'Nisan and Tesvav B'Tishri. According to speak, explain the advantage and the quality of the 15th of Av in comparison to the 15th of Nisan, the 15th of Tishrei. Similar to the advantage of the way of life, which is the teaching and the rebuke of ethical teaching, in comparison and higher than the mitzvah being likened to a candle and Torah being likened to light. The main time And the main revelation of the inner part of Torah, the way of life, will be when Mashiach comes. Even though the whole Kunstz Chaim is to encourage us nowadays, encourage the Bachram to study the inner part of the Torah, but that doesn't compare to the real revelation of it will be Mashiach comes. Then it will be the revelation of the Torah of Mashiach. Hainum, this means to say as follows. What does it mean? Then will be the revelation. Wasn't there Matan Torah already? And the Matan Torah and Torah. It's true that by Matan Torah, all matters of the Torah were already given, including the inner part of the Torah. V'gam kol masher Talmud bas kaslo chadish. Also, anything and everything a diligent student will come up with something new. So even though on the one hand we're calling it new, still in all, it's given at that time. It's given at the time of Matan Torah. Hein nigla Torah, vein pnimius Torah. Both the revealed part of the Torah and the inner part of the Torah. Okay, do up Pisgam, like it's known, the expression Shalayi Oidapam Matan Torah. The Alter Rebbe says this in Tanya, that Matan Torah will not be again. There was one time the giving of the Torah, therefore, by extension, the inner part of the Torah was given then as well. Alpha became still in all, despite the fact that we're saying that the inner part of the Torah is something that it was already included and given by Matan Torah. Hari Amr Chazal, the Chazal still said Torah Salam Haza Hevel who look at it from Mashiach, that Chazal said that the Torah of this time, of our world, that was given by Matan Torah, is considered insignificant, like air and so on, the vanities in comparison to the Torah of Mashiach. So we see that the Chazal themselves make this distinction, and they say that there's the Torah that we're studying now versus the Torah we're going to study in Mashiach's time, even though the Chazal obviously also believed and accepted that Matan Torah would only be one time, and everything was given them. How can we say so? If everything was given already by Matan Torah, why does the Chazal say that our Torah learning now is only considered like Hevel in comparison to the Torah of Mashiach? The reason for that is then when Mashiach comes, they'll be added in the revelation of the inner part of the Torah in a way that's incomparable to what we are now, whatever type of knowledge we have with the inner part of the Torah now. Like we mentioned before, the Kunstz Chaim is about teaching us to have the inner part of the Torah now as well, to study the inner part of the Torah. So we do study the inner part of the Torah, but it's nothing in comparison. It's heavily even in comparison to what's going to be when Mashiach comes. Similar to this is also the advantage and the ascent of Tu B'Av over Tesva B'Nissan and Tesva B'Tishrei. It says, if you add up the Tisha B'Av, since the Tu B'Av is in direct relationship to how low the descent was in Tisha B'Av, it's similar to the advantage and the elevation of the future times. In the third base of Migdash, all of them are concerning the third base of Migdash. It says, Migdash Adna Kainu Yadach, on the Migdash of Hashem, your hands prepared. In other words, Hashem prepared it. Binyana de Kuchabrichu. It's a building that Hashem built. So the Zohar says, therefore, it's going to continue existing, not like all the first two Bate Migdashes that were built by man. It will be everlasting. Like explained in the mimer that we were referring to earlier, in Tafresh I. Any question?
You said something about evolving, eventually evolve into Klupa. What did you mean by that?
And Eitz Hadas, the level of Eitz Hadas, the level of the tree of the Eitz Hadas is the root for Klupa. And the same thing, the idea of Torah that has to do with Eitz Hadas, which is the revealed part of the Torah. It deals with all types of negative connotations, it deals with issues of disputes, and it deals with things that might not be kosher and so on. So in Seder Ishtalshlus, it's the beginning, it's the start of where eventually Klippa gets its highest. Okay, Ois Daled, bottom of the page. Hagdim to understand this, the connection with the revelation of Mashiach's time, the revelation of the third base of Mikdash that Tuba was about. Kamden Gela base of Mikdash, also concerning the base of Mikdash, Yeshkam Dugmas Gimel in Yonam Anal. There's also similar to these three things. In other words, there's Ner Mitzvah, V'Torah Oir, and Derech Hayim, or Tesvav B'Nissen, Tesvav B'Tishrei, and Tesvav B'Av. There's first of all Bayis Rishon, and then there's a Bayis Sheni. Beheim, B'Dugmas, Beis, Eifani, Avoided, the Tzadikim, and Baal Tshuva. They're similar to the two types of Avoid of Tzadikim and Baal Tshuva, because the Beis Hamikdash Harishon was built when the Jewish people were in their prime, if you will. Times of Shlomo HaMelech, the Jewish people were doing what they were supposed to do, etc. So they were in this level of tzaddikim. That's also in a continuation of what was built. It's all a continuation of Yetzias Mitzrayim that we said before. They were in a state of tzaddikim. The second Beis Hamikdash was built after they returned from Golus. They went into Golus because they did whatever they did wrong. And now they did Shuvah, so they earned their way back, and now they rebuilt the Beis Hamikdash. The second Beis Hamikdash is similar to the Avodah Baal Shuvah. But higher than the first and the second Beis Hamikdash, the Avodah Tzadikim, the Avodah Baal Shuvah, Nisan, Tishrei, Ehu Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi the La'asid Lavoy. It's the third Beis Hamikdash of Mashiach's time. Top of the next page. Hine Klolos Eilish Beis Hamikdash, the general advantage of the Beis Hamikdash. In general, the common denominator is bias. Lashem Muchad Lias Makriv Ma'akar Bonis, a poem for the Eibishter that's ready and available to offer korbanos. That's the Rambam says right away in the beginning of Hilchos Beis Abchira, but what the point of the Beis Hamikdash is. The Beis Hamikdash is not like the Mishkan that was in the Midbar, that was only a temporary place. It's actually an everlasting home. Loshna Rambam, like the expression that the Rambam uses, it's a home for generations and generations. This idea that it's a home, a house, a place ready to offer korbanos in a everlasting manner, that was both in the first and second Beis Hamikdash. And more specifically, in the first Beis Hamikdash was the five things that were lacking in the second Beis Hamikdash. There was no fire coming out from heaven in the second Beis Hamikdash. There was no Aron, there was no Luchas, there was no Kruvim, and what the Chazal enumerate over there, five different things. Another advantage of the first Beis Hamikdash was built through Shlomo HaMelech. That it was the 15th generation since Avram Avinu. That the number 15 symbolizes the full moon. Like the Medrash used the term that the disk of the Levana was full, meaning that there was a full moon spiritually. This is actually, the Medrash uses the same concept like we brought in the Zohar in the previous Maimer, that he says, that the moon was full. It was considered such a great divine revelation, the moon at its fullest, that we even use the term that Shlomo HaMelech sat on Avaya's throne, meaning it was such a great revelation of God. Bayis Sheni in the second Beis Hamikdash, in the Afkish, numbered by V'ikavdam, or Chabdam Mechuser Hey, it says over there in the Nevuah about how Chagi was told about the rebuilding of the second Beis Hamikdash. But when it says the word V'achabda, that I will honor it or become respected, it says without the letter Hey. Why is it missing the letter Hey? So the Chazal darshan from it, Kivin Shechosr by Chamisha Dvarim, since it was lacking five things as we mentioned before. Yet, despite the fact that it seems to be that the second Beis Hamikdash was less to some degree than the first, we're going to bring that in a certain way, it's just the opposite. The second Beis Hamikdash is even greater than the first. Still, it says in the Navi, God will give the biases greater will be the honor and glory of this latter Beis Hamikdash than the first. Now the question is, which is the latter Beis Hamikdash? One of the explanation Gemara in the second Baba Basra, the Koya Bayis Sheni, it's referring to the second base of Mikdash, that it was greater than the first year base of Mikdash. In what way was it greater? So he explains it stood longer amount of time. By years, it was older. What does that mean? So the first base of Mikdash stood for 410 years, and the second base of Mikdash stood for 420 years. That's why the Navi says, that the final base of Mikdash, the second base of Mikdash, is greater, that it stood longer. This means the sage, Rabbi is Shani in the second base of Mikdash. That was after the descent of the destruction of the first base of Mikdash. And it had an advantage over the first base of Mikdash. Just like the theme we've been talking about. That Tu B'Av, since it follows Tisha B'Av, is greater than the 15th of any other month. The same thing, the second base of Mikdash that followed the destruction of the first base of Mikdash is greater and higher. And that greatness expressed itself in the fact that it stood 10 years longer. And why is that so? Like similar to because the idea of the advantage of the light that comes out of the darkness because it followed the colors, and the advantage of wisdom out of foolishness. Again, because since it followed the darkness, so therefore it's greater. Similar to the advantage of the final luchas that came down on Yom Kippur, that through the second luchas was added an increase in Torah. It's very interesting. The first luchas seeming to be were so much greater. They were written by Hashem. They were given by Hashem. Everything about the first luchas were Hashem given. The second luchas, Hashem told Moshe to write. It was seemingly of a much lower caliber. And yet we say that there was so much more given with the second luchas than the first luchas. Why is that so? Because of the yerida that happened through the breaking of the first luchas. That caused that with the second luchas had to be so much greater. What was so much greater? Kedisa, Medrash Rabbah, Parsh Kisisa, like it's brought on Medrash Rabbah and Parsh Kisisa. That Hashem told Moshe, "Beluchas shniyas hayin nois in love, shia b'em halachas medrash v'agots." The second luchas I'm giving you, that it will have in it halachas, it will have in it medrash, it will have in it agadata. Though this is what it says in the pasuk, "Vayagid l'chot halum is choch." He related to you the concealed level of chokhmah. You can fly him with the shiyam, because it's doubled for strength. In other words, the second time around, the doubling of it is an extra strength, and there is now the concealed levels of Chachma, which was not given in the first luchas. So just like the second luchas, even though they came after a Yerida, or because they came after Yerida, and seemingly one would think that the second luchas are not as great as the first luchas, they're not as spiritual, not as holy, etc., etc. Still in all, the second luchas have so much more to them because it's an elevation that comes after the descent. In the same way, similar to this, we can say concerning the time of the second base of Mikdash. Though there was deficient in the second base of Mikdash, there was lacking in the base of Mikdash 5 things that we were speaking about before. They were still involved in Torah study. And the way they were involved in Torah study was so much greater than earlier. Because actually it says that that why was the land destroyed? Because in the manner that they weren't involved in the study of Torah in the first base of Mikdash. So where do we see an increase in Torah? In the second base of Mikdash, like the increase in Torah, when they're increased, there was a lot of students of Shammai, a lot of students of Hillel, that they didn't have enough training, if you will. They didn't do enough internship. By days of Rabba, Machlokes B'Yisrael, through that, there was many, many more disputes in the East of Chagiga, like it's brought down Masechtas Chagiga. That in earlier generations, there was not many disputes. From the times of Bayis Sheni, as the generations became lower, and the students seemingly did not put in as much effort as was necessary. So there was much more disputes. So we see there was a lot of Torah learning going on. Now that I was going to say, but disputes seem to be a negative. A dispute is seemingly something deficient, and it's a descent. You need idea you read in the Twas of Aliyah, specifically through descent, there's added an ascent. That's the increase in Torah that happens through the different back and forth that's going on, the pilpul that's going on amongst the students. So on the one hand, you can look at it as a negative. On the other hand, there is so much more Torah now. But if in such a manner, there are words of the school of Shammai, there's the words of the school of Hill. And we say, both these and those, the Beis Shammai and the Beis Hill are the words of the living God. It's not chas v'shalom that one is not Torah. This is already after much time passed, even at times of the second base of Mikdash, that in the times of the second base of Mikdash, initially, even though there might have been disputes, but it wasn't in such a way that was an increase of machloikis amongst the Eden. Why? Because even if there was a disagreement, because already immediately, initially, in the beginning, they reached the clarity of the matter. Similar to the much Torah that's to be found in the Talmud of Bavel. Talmud Yerushalmi is only a few volumes. The Gemara that we have, which is called Talmud Bavli, is so much more. So it's literally, just even look at it quantitatively, forget about qualitatively. There's a lot more Torah came out from Bavel. The Afshav Machshak Mishavan is a Talmud of Bavel, though the Chazal say that the fact that he's placed me in darkness, that is the Torah study of Bavel, indicating because it's dark to them, and therefore they had to elaborate a lot more, and they had a lot more questions and issues that they had to address, whereas Talmud Yerushalmi was much more straight, and they saw the light right away. But yet, only in the darkness of the Torah study of Bavel, Daf Kisham is Bareres Halacha Psuka, specifically over there, in the Talmud of Bavel, is refined and clarified what is the clear halacha, because they went through so many questions and so many debates and so many issues. So the clarity that they come in the Talmud Shel Bavel is so much greater than Talmud Yerushalmi. Because the halacha, the ruling is, when we find a dispute between Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi, we rule like the Talmud Bavli. Why do we rule like the Talmud Bavli? Seemingly, we just now said, Machshak Meshivani, it's a darkness, it's a lot of disputes, it's a lot of difficulty, etc., etc. But just the opposite. Because there is all about all the disputes and all the questions, so because of all the questions, we come out to much more clarity than if you wouldn't have the questions. And therefore, the halacha follows the Talmud Bavli. So this is all examples of a level of descent that brings to an ascent, the level of Bayis Sheni versus Bayis Rishon, the level of Luchas Shniyos versus Luchas Rishonis, the level of Bavli in comparison to Yerushalmi, the many machloikos of Talmidei Beis Hillel and Talmidei Beis Shammai over what was in prior generation. So in a similar vein, as that is understood, that the descent itself brought to a greater ascent, so too, by extension, it's even more so concerning the revelation of Mashiach's times that comes because of the darkness of our days. This understood also concerning the general avoided these days. Days of Boim, the loss of love, that specifically through this we come to the advantage of the future time. Then there'll be the third base of Mikdash in a way that will be everlasting. After all the advantages in the first base of Mikdash and the second base of Mikdash, So the advantage and the quality of the third Beis Hamikdash will be incomparable because it will be such a type of revelation that will go on forever, as opposed to the first and second Beis Hamikdash that was not everlasting. Why did we have an everlasting? Why are we going to have an everlasting Beis Hamikdash the third time around? Because of the great descent, because of the great Yerida. So therefore, the Aliyah is so much greater. Stop over here. Any questions?